Frederick Douglass once said that power concedes nothing without a struggle. We're going to talk about certain aspects of that struggle today. Our guest is State Senator David Paterson. Today is Friday, March 23rd, and welcome to Conversations at Wadley. Good afternoon, Senator Paterson.
Good afternoon.
Could you begin by telling us what are the boundaries for the senatorial district that you represent?
96th Street and Broadway, all the way up to 181st Street and Fort Washington Avenue, over to Riverside Drive to the west, and over to Park Avenue to the east. And so the district is the Upper West Side, Morningside Heights, Columbia University area, West and Central Harlem, parts of East Harlem, and Washington Heights.
How would you assess the present state of black people statewide, in the city, and especially here in Harlem?
Well, black people here in Harlem have diminished by 2/3 of what the number was 50 years ago. There were 300,000 African Americans that lived in Harlem then. They're now about 90,000. And we fought for years to get banks to start lending money in Harlem. We fought for years to get banks to even have offices in Harlem. We fought for years to get businesses that traditionally were downtown to come into Harlem. We fought for years to get businesses like Chinese restaurants and pizza places to deliver to Harlem. Now that that's happened, we realize that part of the reason that they're delivering and being so cooperative is that the demographics, meaning the types of people that live in Harlem, are changing. The amount of money it costs to buy a brownstone is $500,000 to $1 million now. So what could very easily happen is some of the low and moderate income residents of Harlem might be put out, which is what we call displaced, by the fact that the amount of money that it costs to live here is so high. So what we're fighting is what we call gentrification, in a sense displacing people with new people that make a whole lot more money. So my fear is that people who live in Harlem may wind up living in Westchester or Connecticut or New Jersey or Long Island, where they used to live in Harlem, where they feel Harlem's their home, but they might not be able to afford to live there. So the whole problem of black people in the state and in the country primarily is economic. The average black person is worth about $50,000, and the average Caucasian American is worth about $500,000. When I say worth, in other words, if you died and you left a will, that's with insurance and everything, that's probably how much you'd be worth. We're all worth an unaccountable amount of money in terms of just the fact that we're human beings. But what we would like to do is to change the situation so that the dollar that gets spent stays in the community. And the more that happens, the more you can create employment in the community, and the more people in the community can make money and then re-spend their money in places that benefits us, and rather than others, as it's traditionally been.
You know, a couple of weeks ago, I was sitting in a brownstone on 137th Street. I was talking to a friend of mine who grew up in the Lincoln Projects, and he was lamenting the fact that, as you mentioned, the indigenous people of Harlem can't afford to purchase a brownstone now. He felt that we were being priced out of the market. And he was convinced, the conversation was quite exhausting, but he was convinced that at least part of that responsibility lay at the feet of some of our leaders, some of our politicians. Do you lend any credence to that perspective? And if so, what can we do to try and change that?
Well, no leader anywhere has ever assessed property value. That's something that flows via the market. And what simply happened is that Harlem is probably the most precious real estate right now in the whole world. It's in New York City, which is the effective capital of the world. The financial and service industries, the real estate industry, all the economic centers are located in New York. The United Nations is located in New York. And the traditional living quarters, the Lower East Side, Midtown Manhattan, the Upper West Side, the Upper East Side, have all been oversaturated and overdeveloped. When I first started in office 15 years ago, the West Side, with a great deal of leadership and political power, was overwhelmed by commercial developers and real estate speculators. So if you walk up and down Columbus Avenue and Amsterdam Avenue and Broadway, you will no longer see the tailors and the shoe stores and the little shops and the candy stores that you saw 15 years ago. Now you see large apartment buildings that have been put in and huge commercial eateries, restaurants. And they couldn't stop it, and now it's coming into Harlem. What your friend is doing is exercising frustration in the direction of elected political leaders who have very little control over any property that's not public. Now, of the public property in Harlem, that which was owned by the city of New York, half of that has now been turned into buildings that have been repurchased at low prices by the by different tenants who lived in the building, and also by individuals who wanted to buy those properties. But what's happened as time's gone on, as they've become owners, they are susceptible as any other owner is. If somebody comes in and offers you more than you think the value of your house is, you probably take the deal. So what's happening is that we're being overwhelmed by those who made a lot of money in the early 90s in the stock market and in real estate and commercial development, who are literally coming to Harlem and overwhelming the neighborhood with their resources and literally spending huge amounts of money to buy these properties because they know the property value is going up. So what I would say is that this same phenomena occurred in other parts of the city, and no one blamed the political leaders in those neighborhoods when that happened. And so, though it's something that we've tried to create a lot of programs to try to stop, I think the most important thing to recognize is that there's still a lot of city property in the neighborhood that we can develop.
Okay. A couple of months ago, the publisher emeritus of the Amsterdam News, Mr. Wilbur Tatum, sat in that very chair where you sit. And one of the things he said has left an indelible impression in my mind. He said, and I quote, that the revitalization effort in Harlem was nothing more than a cynical scheme to take Harlem for whites. That statement caused some controversy, I might say. Do you share that perspective? Do you share that view? Do you think it is a cynical scheme to take Harlem back for Caucasians?
Well, I don't think it makes a difference whether it was a scheme or it wasn't a scheme. I think the important thing to look at is the results. And as I pointed out, the black population in Harlem is 1/3 what it was 50 years ago. The value of earnings of the people moving into Harlem is higher and higher. White real estate developers and speculators are in Harlem now. They've got offices. And it kind of doesn't matter if somebody conspired to kill you or if they just killed you. You're still dead. And the point that I'm making is, I don't know that anybody sat in a room the way we're sitting in a room and came up with a plan how to run the black and Latino folk out of Harlem. But what's going on in the neighborhood is as if they did have that meeting. Now, I don't know that people are so organized that they think that way. I just think that this has been a market that has been governed by greed. People knew that if they bought up property, they could resell it. And very quietly, the big real estate moguls in the city have been buying up property, and they are now reselling it at a higher value or selling it only to people who can afford it, many and most of whom are not people who traditionally lived in the community, and that's why you see this this displacement. It's coming from government, from the mayor's office in particular. It's coming from the real estate industry. It's coming from the construction industry that loves to, you know, renovate properties. And because of the fact that we had an unstable market because of all the burned out and abandoned property that was in Harlem, it wasn't really a hard thing to do. But I agree with his conclusion that you're seeing neighborhoods in Long Island like Roosevelt and Hempstead and Uniondale and Rockville Center. Those were all white neighborhoods. That was white flight in the early 60s. When the city started to be integrated, those individuals who didn't like living with African and Latino people moved to Long Island, to parts of New Jersey, up to Westchester, Mount Vernon, New Rochelle, Larchmont, those places. And then they figured out about 20 years later that they didn't feel like riding on Long Island Railroad for 2 hours a day or Metro North for 2 hours a day. So they've come back to the city, and in doing that have displaced the traditional residents of the city.
You know, our concern is for the young men and women that are seated in this audience, because we want to provide them with the information that will allow them to make intelligent decisions. You mentioned the Latino population, and as I thought about that comment, I began to reflect on the fact that there has been a significant increase in the so-called Hispanic population of this country, and in particular this city. Do you see any opportunities for forging some kind of a dialogue or some kind of an initiative that will allow us to have more self-determination and control over our communities? That is the Latino community and the black community?
Well, we have a black, Puerto Rican, and Hispanic legislative caucus where all of us who are of African or Dominican or Puerto Rican descent get together and work on the issues that affect our communities jointly. We do have to understand that we sometimes have different issues. For instance, at one time, there were almost 100,000 Latino students in special education. Most of them were in special education because they didn't speak the English language well, not because they really had any learning disability. And we found that of the black students in special education, that 80% of them were black males. Now, if you have a learning disabilities come to human beings equally, whether you're black or white or Asian or Hispanic. So why would 4 times the males be in special education than the females? Perhaps because there was a perception on the part of those who were putting people in special education, making a decision who was going to go in there, that the males were disciplinary problems. What they may have considered disciplinary problems may have been just the responses of people who are very bright, very outgoing, have a lot to say, have an opinion, get into stuff. In other communities, that's considered good. That's considered the mark of a leader. That's considered precocious, meaning maybe a little immature, but definitely showing the signs of a leader. Too often in our communities, that's been considered arrogant, militant, pompous, mean-spirited, potentially violent. That's how you get into special education, just because you happen to be a little bit outgoing, a little cocky. Remember, all of the great athletes who demonstrated a little flair, a little cockiness, and they were considered to be, fantastic athletes. People like Pete Rose, the baseball player, or even this basketball player, Jason Williams, and they call him, I can't remember his nickname, but, you know, he's supposed to be, yeah, that's it, white chocolate, you know, great thing. Now, the problem is, when someone that doesn't look like someone you know does it, you know, they're frightening. And so these are the characterizations that people get. And because in minority communities we've been equally characterized, what the result of that has been is that we've had to forge coalitions with each other in order to fight it, because we haven't always had the resources, the media perception that other neighborhoods have had.
Okay. I'm going to ask you to indulge us for a minute and give us a civics lesson. How is the business of government conducted in Albany? What is a typical day like for Senator Paterson?
Well, we have two branches of government in the state. One is the state Senate, one is the state Assembly. Please don't feel inadequate if you don't know that. I can assure you, your teachers don't know it. There are 61 state senators. There are 150 Assembly members. We each cover districts of the same size. A state Senate district covers about 300,000 people. In the Senate, there are two major political parties. The Republican Party is in the majority, the Democratic Party is in the minority. I'm in the Democratic Party. Each party has a leader. Their leader, you may have read about in the newspaper, his name is Joe Bruno. Our leader's name is Martin Connor. I'm the deputy to Martin Connor. My job is to debate bills on the floor of the Senate. When the bills come on the floor, the majority party, the Republicans, determine what bills come out. So it's likely that we vote against a lot of the bills. We debate the bills, and here's one of the real key points about the legislature that people don't know. I don't know who gets persuaded by debates. People come to the debate knowing how they feel. At the end of the debate, they feel the same way. So what the debate becomes is not a place where you try to persuade people. It's really a place where you try to make a record of what your point of view is. So hopefully in the next election you can tell the public how your colleagues voted and how they feel about things, so that if eventually you would hope that people who feel the same as you would get elected to those seats. And then if we were in the majority, there are a lot more things that we actually could accomplish. So also part of my day is getting visits in Albany from groups that want to talk about the number of people who need health care but don't have any insurance, the number of children who are younger than kindergarten age who need an early education to give them a nice head start. We call it pre-K. People are fighting issues like poor housing, substance abuse, AIDS, and other problems that we have in our community. And then when we have these meetings, we pass every year, supposedly on April 1st, but we are always late, we pass a budget. And the budget shows how much money we have to spend and where we're going to spend it. And we have to compromise and work out what areas require the most money. So it's lawmaking, it's negotiating on budget when I'm in Albany. Then when I come back here, I'll see many of you. Heat and hot water complaints, people's apartments don't have it, problems trying to get a job, problems getting the police department to cover perhaps drug dealing on your block. We try to intervene and get the police departments to do it. Or sometimes people who are coming and they want to know what are the available apartments in the area, and we try to help them find apartments. So basically, if someone comes in the office, if they have any kind of problem, sometimes they come in with legal problems. Someone is getting divorced, they need a lawyer. We try to help them with that.
Now, I realize there's some constraints in your time, so we're going to move along, and if you could just indulge us for maybe a couple of more questions, we'd appreciate it if you
Sure.
can. One of the reasons why I posed that previous question is that these young people in this audience represent our future, and they're bright and energetic, and all they need is a little bit of advice and an understanding of the system that we operate out of. And I think that perhaps some of these young people might have a desire to pursue a career in politics. What advice can you give any of these young people who may be wondering how they can gain access to those circles which will allow them to pursue politics as a political career?
Well, the best advice I could give you has to do with the fact that after I finished high school, I went to Columbia University, which is about 10 blocks from here. And when I was going to Columbia University, I went to school with this guy who never, I mean, whatever we were doing, he never would put any money into it. In other words, if we had a party, you couldn't get that brother to give you $5 to try to go out and get refreshments for the party. But he always talked about what he was going to do, these plans he had. He'd like to set up programs for children and that kind of thing, because he was going into banking, investment banking. Well, he's gone on to become one of the leading investment bankers in the city of any color. My man has a house somewhere in Massachusetts. He has a house in upstate New York. He has a big apartment around here. And I still see him places. He is still the cheapest. I can't even finish that sentence because we're on television. Now, the problem with him is that his attitude got in the way of his fantasy. In other words, he really says he wanted to help people, and maybe he did. He's helped himself. I don't know anyone else he ever helped. And so my point is, if you want to do something, start doing it now. You'll notice that the same people who got somewhere and they look back and they help people were helping people when they were back there themselves. So my advice is don't forget where you came from, but don't wait until you're in some place where you can really help in a big way. Help in a small way. The same people who maybe never had much, but they'd always give you a little. When they got a lot, they'd give you a lot. And so, believe it or not, people's personalities and their habits are formed when they're 11, 12, 14, 17. Now, when they're 35 and 40 and 45, there are very few people who, when they get older, can change. You know, they're pretty much the way they are. That's why when you talk to your parents and you try to get them to change their point of view and you notice that they don't, because they're locked into their point of view from years ago. I'm in my 40s. I'm still trying to get my parents to change. And my point is that what it is that you believe in, what it is that you want to do, you can start now. So in other words, if you're interested in government, you can read the newspapers, you know, figure out what's going on, talk to other people about it. Even at your age, you can get involved in different ways of volunteering and you know, checking things out. If your aspiration is in the theater, obviously there's a theater club here. You can join it. You can start acting now. You can walk around and mimic the people who you enjoy. So my advice is that even though you're legally not given the right now to drive a car or make your own decisions or make your own choices sometimes, but you can start to do a lot of the things that you want to do in the future. There's always a way to start now. And so when that future comes, whatever is your dream, it won't get denied because you've developed a bunch of bad habits along the way. One that I had was that I never, for some reason, I always imagined myself going to a lot of places. But when it was time to go, I never went. So I never really traveled much. I went to high school in New York. I went to college in New York. I went to law school in New York. I've always been, you know, right around here. When I finally looked up and I had never really traveled that much, I figured it out. In other words, I figured out that those were habits I developed over the year, and it was kind of difficult to break them. So the best way not to develop them is to start dreaming about what you want to be now. And there's nothing wrong with fantasy. There's nothing wrong with imagining yourself in a particular situation. When I used to sit in rooms like this, I never dreamed that I would be in front of a room talking to people who would be my age years later. And the thing that bothers me is that I didn't think about that. Why shouldn't I have thought that I could speak to school students at that particular time? So I'm hoping that you won't make the mistake I made and not believe in yourself. You can pretty much do whatever it is that you want to do, but the first thing you have to do is to believe in it.
We're going to give you a chance to ask Senator Paterson some questions because he's going to have to leave shortly. So I'd like you to think about any questions or any concerns you might have so that you can put them before him now. Senator Paterson, while these young people are getting their questions together, I have a question about Mr. Giuliani. As we all know, his reign of terror is about to come to an end. I've thought that he was a very mean-spirited individual, and I haven't seen anything that would convince me otherwise. Do you see on the horizon any candidate, be it the Bronx president or Mr. Vallone or any of the other possible candidates? Do you see, or which of them, I should say, do you think will look at and govern all of the communities of New York with the most equitable perspective? Do you support any of those candidates?
Well, compared to Mayor Giuliani, I'll take any of them. And they have different strengths. There are 4 candidates. Peter Vallone, who is the Speaker of the City Council, I think he probably could run the city the best. Alan Hevesy, who's the controller, probably has the best reputation for getting things done. Fernando Ferrer, the Bronx Borough president, I think would be the best person for the city. I think he knows all the neighborhoods, isn't afraid to go to them, has friends in all the neighborhoods. I think he understands people better than everyone else. And Mark Green, who is the public advocate, and when he ran for public advocate, he beat me for that office. But just to show you that there are no hard feelings, he probably has the best vision for the city. In other words, his concept of what he'd like to see the city become and the interaction of people and the contributions we could all make is probably the best. I haven't picked between them, and I think the reason I haven't picked between them is none of them, to me, as yet, and there's still time, has really stepped up and said, I want to be the leader. They've all stepped up and said how they're doing in the polls and how much money they raise, how many people are supporting them. But sometimes when you want to be a leader, you have to step up and do something a little differently than maybe other people did it, and you have to stick to it. What happens to too many politicians today is they stand up and they say something only after they think it's safe. Now, the greatest leader this country's had in the last 50 years, Martin Luther King, never checked the compass to see how he was doing. He never looked to see whether people were clapping to get an idea how he was doing. He did what he did because he thought it was right. And if it's good enough for you, then it's good enough for you to say.
Mentioning Martin Luther King, it's interesting. In the 60s, I recall his having said that black people, or the condition of black people, would never improve so long as a Negro in the South couldn't vote and a Negro in the North felt that he had nothing for which to vote. And I think about the appalling, the dismally low number of persons from our communities who turn out to vote. The Giuliani administration is a good example when he was running against Mayor Dinkins. Had we turned out in greater numbers, I dare say that perhaps Giuliani would never have come to power. So I'm concerned as to what we can do to let these brothers and sisters here realize the gravity of the situation? What can we do to help them to realize that they control their destinies, particularly with the rise in the Hispanic population? I'm really concerned about that because they need to know that in order for us to take control of our lives, we need to do this by any means necessary.
Well, earlier you were talking about a friend of yours who blamed issues involving housing on the elected officials. And I was pretty defensive of myself and my colleagues because that is an area that is a money area, and money is going to beat politics every time. But now you've touched on an area where I definitely have got to blame my colleagues, and it had to do with the re-election of Mayor Dinkins in 1993. In 1989 is when David Dinkins got elected mayor. In 1993 is when he got re-elected. 1989, we had a grassroots operation in our communities, black and Latino. David Dinkins won 97% of the black community, 72% of the Latino community. People voted in high numbers, and that's how he won. 1993, it's my opinion that my colleagues took our people for granted. We didn't campaign there. We didn't send literature there. And the thing you have to remember about black people and Latino people is like everybody else, we are consumers. If you want my vote, knock on the door and ask for it. Send me a letter. Get on TV where I can see you. And because of the fact that we had so many new voters, they don't identify as much when you see people on TV. You've got to campaign in the neighborhood, put campaign offices in the neighborhood, and the vote was down 8% in 1993, and that's why Giuliani won. If the vote had been the same, you'd never known some of these things that Giuliani would eventually do. But in the year 2000, we learned our lesson. The vote in November, the turnout in the minority communities was as high as it was in any of the white communities. By ethnicity, the highest vote came out in the African American and Latino neighborhoods. So we were all set up to get blamed for Al Gore losing. Al Gore lost on his own and didn't have anything to do with us because we turned out in huge numbers. Now, maybe if somebody had the voting machines working all right in Florida, we would have noticed that the election had a good result. But one of the things that I am very much against is not only blaming our leaders, but blaming ourselves. We have an immense opportunity, those of you who are younger and those of us who are getting a little older. If we start to look at who we are and what we can be, and I think that those numbers turning out the way they were in the presidential election last year, if we do it again this year, we will choose the next mayor. It might not be exactly the person that we would have wanted, but it'll be a whole lot better than letting someone else choose, which is what happened 8 years ago.
Okay. Thank you. I know that the senator has to go now, in a few minutes, I should say. He's graciously, though, considered to entertain a couple of questions from the young brothers and sisters here. Can you step up to the mic and pose your question? Yes, sir. We're going to ask you to step up to the mic, though. Yes, sir.
Okay, when did you become a Senate?
Let us know who you are.
Oh, my name is Osborne Moss. And when did you become a Senate? How many years have you been in it? And why do you enjoy your job?
I became a senator in 1985. The senator who was in office before me died in office, and I ran for his seat, and people told me that you're probably too young and you won't win, but it would be a very good experience for you. And I believed him. But during the campaign, you know, sometimes things break your way, and I became the senator. The reason I enjoy my job is because no 2 days are alike. Something different happens every day. Sometimes I've been in some of the most difficult situations and have felt like I couldn't fix them, like people come to the office and your heart kind of goes out to them. They have real difficult issues. They haven't been given a fair chance. And then there are other days that, you know, you pick up the phone and it's like President Clinton asking you if you know a good place on 125th Street where he could find an office. And you can't believe he's actually talking to you. One day I got into an argument in front of a group of people with the governor. If I do say so myself, I destroyed him. He didn't know what he was talking about. But the same night, I went to a parent-teachers conference meeting, and this lady got up. I don't think this lady, she was a parent, had ever finished high school, but she wanted to ask me about how they never let black and Latino students into the gifted and talented program. And I was telling her the way the process works, and she told me that's not the way it works. So I re-explained it to her, and she said that's not the way it works, and she started explaining it to me. And I realized that she had read that section and knew it by heart. And I was getting my butt kicked in front of 200 parents. And only in a job like this could you make the governor look like a jerk and then go to the next meeting and a parent who took the time to prepare themselves made you look like you don't even speak English. So I didn't like the second experience. But the point was that it's exciting. You know, you better be prepared. You never know, you know, what's going to happen tomorrow. In 1990, I did a voter registration rap concert right in front of the state office building on 125th Street. And none of the other elected officials would be involved. They thought there was going to be violence there. I thought there'd be about 5,000 kids there, and we got some security. We didn't think there'd be any violence. There were 35,000 kids there, and as a result of that concert, I became very popular in the industry because I had given them that chance to perform, because they had to have permission to use state property. 1991, everybody that ever got elected to anything was there taking credit for the fact that it happened, and it made me feel kind of proud that I had believed in these young entertainers. And the producer was 19 at the time, and he grew up to be Puff Daddy. The interesting thing was he called me to ask me to come down to testify for him. And I was like, well, you know, Puff, we got to be in Albany a lot this time of year. But I actually did agree to do it, but they never actually put me, mercifully, they didn't put me on the witness stand. But the point is, some of the people you're sitting next to, you never know where they'll wind up. Now, don't tell us where you think the people sitting next to you are going to wind up, but that's what makes the job exciting.
Okay. Kevon, do you have a question for Senator Patterson before we... Okay. Young ladies, do any of you have questions? Or any of the young men here? Do you have it? Okay, Benjamin? Incidentally, this young man is an actor. He just finished a role in Soldier's Play, and he's getting ready to do West Side Story.
My name is Benjamin Walker, and I want to know if, the way the presidential election is going now, do you think there's a chance for a black person to become president?
That's a good question. I don't think that American society is ready to elect a black president, to be perfectly honest with you. I think that we have a society now where we interact with each other more, and people have accepted, have a higher tolerance for the fact that we live in this country. But I don't know if you heard, since you're going into this industry, that the NAACP is still fighting with the networks about the number of blacks and Latinos who get on the regular series. And that's one of the reasons that Fox started running their own series and were taking the ratings away from like CBS and NBC and ABC, because they knew there was a black audience. And yet, one of the reasons that that's the case is that while I don't think people hang each other and burn down people's houses like might have happened in the South 50 years ago, I don't know if you could vote a black president of this country right now. Go ahead.
One more question. Benjamin, did you have a follow-up?
Then you look like you have a follow-up.
Okay. He's going to indulge you, my brother.
I wanted to know how you feel about the shootings in the high schools.
I think that there is. You wanna know what I really think about it? I think it's interesting that none of those shooters was of a minority group. See, first of all, I think even if you're in high school, if you're black and Latino, you know if you came to school and started shooting people, you would never live to even get tried for anything. But very seriously, I think that if the shooters, if it was going on in schools in our neighborhoods, they'd be talking about the inhuman people that live in Harlem and the savagery that goes on and the way they shoot and kill each other and that kind of thing. And I can't help but make that comment. That's my first reaction. My second one is one of real compassion for people who are so young, who are so desperate and so lost that they resort to that kind of violence against people that never did anything to them and people they don't know. It, to me, just demonstrates the disconnected nature of the relationship between parents and children, and perhaps the fact that because most of these shootings occurred in these suburban neighborhoods, they thought that just because there weren't gangs, and just because there may not have been a high concentration of drugs, and all the things they've accused our neighborhoods of, that they didn't realize there's that same human misery. And since maybe those kids, they don't have gangs for them to escape to and they don't have drugs, they have chosen this kind of form of massive destruction where they kill other types of humanity. When this society recognizes that people are suffering of all colors, we'll start to address those issues. So I think it's a psychological thing that we have to go through as a society. And maybe when this society stops blaming all its problems on either young people or members of different groups, we'll start to really listen when people are talking and to address some of their points of view. You know, I came here today and I told you what I think. But what I will be willing to do is to come back here someday because I have some questions. And I want to know what you think.
Great. We have time for one more question. Sharita, this young lady is reprising a role in Colored Girls, which opens here on the 19th. Excellent actress. She is also president of the student body here. So we have a young leader who's going to rock the world. Who knows? She might try and take your job one day.
That's encouraging.
Speaking of that, I was just going to ask, you said that human society is not ready for a black president. Do you think that human society is ready for a woman to be a president?
Maybe. I think we'll see a woman elected president in this country faster than we'll see an African American or a Latino. And let me tell you why. You know that there's always been a debate over what they call affirmative action. You all have heard of that? Well, affirmative action, the numbers of blacks and Latinos who got into college or who started businesses was up only slightly, even with all the affirmative action. You know, if you hear them talk about it, it's as if, oh, you know, we used to have good jobs and then these people came and took our jobs and they didn't score as well as we did on tests. That really didn't happen. The one place it did happen was women-owned businesses. Women are 50% of the lawyers in this country now, but in the next 10 years, women will be 55% of the lawyers in this country. The boundaries for women in business and economics are being broken down, and already a woman has run for vice president, and there are 9 United States senators who are women. There are no blacks. Now, the problem that I think women have in this society is the individual problem of getting respect from men, not only as women, but as half of the human society that can think, that can write, that can read, that can teach, that can be lawyers, that can be doctors, and can run this country. So, in other words, I think it's a kind of, I know even now that a woman was running my staff a few years ago, and this guy came up to me and he said, I need to talk to you. This is like an emergency. I need to come in your office. And I said, well, I'm not going to be there tomorrow. And I said, but you can see my chief of staff. And he said, well, give me his name and I'll call him. So before I could even say that my chief of staff was a woman, he turned to the woman and said, could you excuse us for a minute? So the woman that ran my staff went, and she stood on the other side of the room, and he said, now what was your chief of staff's name? I said, well, that's the person you just dismissed. So now you can go over there and ask her if she'll see you tomorrow. He goes, well, could you speak to her for me? I said, no, brother, you're on your own. You go there and talk to her yourself, because she runs the staff, and what was the reason you dissed her? You know, and so I think that's a problem. But my honest feeling is that the endemic history of this country for oppressing people, especially racially, is so deep that not only do I think we couldn't elect a black president, but you know how after Martin Luther King marched, we passed the Federal Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965? I'll bet you if we took those laws away, in other words, if we just wiped them off the books, I'll bet you that the Congress that's in Washington right now couldn't pass them again.
I would concur with that. Sarita, do you have another question there before we conclude?
So what was your answer to the question?
Yes, but of course. Sooner than you think. They stepping up now.
What sooner than you think?
Soon, the next election.
Who do you think that person is going to be?
No
Mrs.
answer.
Clinton?
That's who I think it is.
Oh.
She's already there. She closer than you.
Who?
Hillary.
Oh, Hillary could be elected president?
Yep. It wasn't a question.
I think Hillary is perfectly capable of running this country. I think that there's this hatred for Hillary all around this country, and I've never known what she ever did to deserve it. If she'd stayed with her man, they would have said she was an opportunist. If she left her man, they would have said she was an opportunist. I actually don't think Hillary could be elected president. Not because I wouldn't vote for her, because I would. But when Hillary Clinton gets elected president, I owe you a lunch.
I'm looking forward to that.
Sometimes when I'm talking to some of the old folks who live in Harlem, they often say that they could walk out of their door and see Paul Robeson or Du Bois or Arnold Bontemps or Langston Hughes, and that isn't the reality so much anymore. So we've tried to bring some real sheroes and heroes before these young people here today. So we appreciate the fact that you've consented to come. And as we conclude this conversation, I'm going to ask you one final question. I know that you're only 40 years old, so none of these young people could possibly be your biological children. However, I'm going to ask you, if you would, just to imagine that these are your children, And they're about to go out into the world, and they're concerned about many of the things that we've talked about this afternoon. They're concerned about police brutality, racism, miseducation, no education. They're really concerned. And they really want to try and get some sense of the legacy to which they are heir. So they come to you and they say, Daddy, what do we need to do to try and navigate our way through these minefields that we're going to face? What can you tell us about who we are? What do I owe myself? What do I owe my brother, my sister? What do I owe humanity? What advice do you have for me?
Well, one of the things when we were talking about whether or not Hillary could be elected president, one of the reasons I think that we might not have agreed is because you have to remember, and I grew up in this neighborhood, that you're generally around people that have the same point of view that you have. And one of the reasons that we have police brutality is that there are whole neighborhoods of folk around this state who have totally different points of view than the ones we have. And the police, many of them don't live in our neighborhoods. They don't understand our community. They come in here, they believe the stereotypes about crime. They think every young person is a potentially violent person. They think everybody wants to attack the police. They don't understand that we all work as hard as they do, that our dreams are the same as their dreams. And it's that attitude that I think is a little more prevalent in the society than other people might think, who are a little more optimistic. Mayor Giuliani has been mean-spirited at times. He's not the only one. And remember, more people voted for him the second time than they did the first time, and nobody even really knew what he was about until the second time. So you've got to understand that we can talk here about which is the right way to do it, but there are a lot of people out there who have totally different points of view than we have. Let me just give you an example. If you went to prison and you tried to get yourself together and you wanted to go and get your high school degree, your college degree, well, you can't pay for it because you're in prison. So what we did is we had a lot of programs where a lot of people who are incarcerated get their college degrees. So when they come out, now they already have a record. That's a mark on them. They already have lost their right to vote, which I think should be restored. That's a mark against them. So the least we could do is help them get a college degree. Most of the people in the Senate voted recently to have all prisoners be given a bill when they leave prison, like with all your other problems. You don't have a job, you don't know if your family is going to take you back, you don't know where to live, and now they're going to give you a bill for any education you received while you were in prison. Now, if that isn't stupid, I don't know what is. So I'm just trying to convey the thought that there are a lot of people out here who are antagonistic to seeing people like ourselves become successful, and they are pretty high-handed about it. So my suggestion is that you know in advance that if you have a belief, something you want to do, there's going to come a time when you're going to be shaking your head saying, no, this just isn't going to work. I thought it would work, but I didn't know about all these obstacles. What you need to take away from this conversation is that obstacles just test you. They just test your ability to keep going. And if you hang in there, it will work out. There are times when it seems like everything's going against you. But if you hold on and display a little faith, things will actually work out. And the only thing that I ask of you, since I'm not 40, I'm 46, and I do have children your age, that there'll come a time when one of you should come and put me out of my misery and send me back to private life and run and become the new senator. And I just hope that you'll take some time out and come back and talk to the younger people in the neighborhood, because you might just be able to strike a nerve with someone and give them the encouragement to come along and take your place. That's what our parents did for us, but it doesn't always have to be a family thing. That's just what we try to do for the next generation. It's really, in a way, us giving back for those who've made it possible for us to actually get an education as you all are doing it, and hopefully go to college and be very successful.
In conclusion, sir, we thank you sincerely. We also hope that you will consent to come back, because these young people have much to say. Again, thank you for coming to Wadley this afternoon, and go and get help.
Thank you.